I won't even introduce myself by my name anymore. I get nervous when I bump into someone I know in the grocery store who says my name. I'm worried about who's listening. I get nervous when I have to give my name for food orders. I'm always concerned of who's around me. I've lost my name and I've lost my reputation. I've lost my sense of security, all because a group of people, starting with number 45 and his ally, Rudy Giuliani, decided to scapegoat me and my daughter, Shay, to push their own lies about how the presidential election was stolen.
This is the legacy of the current occupant of the White House. Hi again, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in New York. That was Fulton County, Georgia election worker Ruby Freeman on the devastation to her life and her name and her identity caused by Donald Trump's lies and attacks on her and her daughter, Shay Moss, as part of Donald Trump's efforts to steal the 2020 election, which he lost. Now Donald Trump is at it again and widening his attacks to every single person like that, every single election worker in Fulton County, in an effort to weaponize his 2020 election lies to imperil future elections. New York Times reports this, quote, "The Justice Department has demanded the identities of every worker who staffed the 2020 election in Fulton County, Georgia." That's according to court records, escalating an ongoing federal investigation of the 2020 vote in Georgia's most populous county that relies on false and debunked claims. The demand targets employees of Fulton County elections as well as volunteer poll workers who likely numbered in the thousands during the 2020 election, according to court records. In the current investigation into Fulton County, which began with a court-ordered seizure of election materials from a county warehouse, the FBI so far has not named any election workers, let alone publicly accused any of wrongdoing. Fulton County, in a filing, says that the subpoena is the latest move by the Department of Justice to, quote, target and harass the president's perceived political enemies. This time, election officials, poll workers, and volunteers in Fulton County, whom Donald Trump continues to disparage as he perpetuates his false claim that they stole the 2020 election. Its purpose is to punish the president's perceived political opponents. It is grossly overbroad and untethered to any reasonable need. It cannot yield any evidence that could result in a criminal prosecution. It burdens the First Amendment rights of election workers and will chill their participation in elections. And it unreasonably interferes with Georgia's sovereign authority to administer elections. Fulton County's claims are not abstract. We have seen widespread threats of violence caused by Donald Trump's lies about the election. Reuters reports this in the aftermath of Trump's attempt to steal the 2020 election. Quote, "Through public records and interviews, Reuters documented 102 threats of violence or death received by more than 40 election officials, workers, and their relatives in 8 of the most contested battleground states in the 2020 presidential contest. Each was explicit enough to put a reasonable person in fear of bodily harm or death, the typical legal threshold for prosecution. Almost all of the 102 threats of violence appeared to be inspired by Trump's debunked claims that the election was rigged against him. The messages often included highly personal, sometimes sexualized threats of violence or death, not only to the officials themselves, but also to their family members and their children." This latest piece of evidence of Donald Trump's willingness to endanger our election workers and their children in order to undermine our democracy ahead of time is where we start the hour with New York Times reporter who covers elections and voting for the Times, Nick Corsiniti. His byline is on that reporting we just read from. Also joining us, former Assistant Special Agent in Charge at the FBI and National Security and Intelligence Analyst Michael Feinberg is back. Nick, take us through what you're reporting.
So this investigation, has been going on in Fulton County now since January. And we learned pretty quickly that it was based on the same falsehoods and debunked conspiracy theories that have been swirling around Georgia and elections in the country since 2020. But this was a marked change to go after thousands of election workers. And this spans the gamut from people employed by the county, kind of professional election workers, to volunteers, people who drove a bus that moved around a mobile voting unit, and all they were doing were being bus drivers. So it was a really expansive effort, and it doesn't appear to be coming from much else other than, as some of the court documents said last night, and the Fulton County lawyers, that it just feels like a fishing expedition. They can't see what the FBI is trying to get at other than getting all of these names. And it comes at a time when there's a pretty significant chill and fear among election officials across the country. The Brennan Center did a survey, I think last month or very recently, that found about a third of election officials had been subject to harassment or violent threats. And 1 in 4 were legitimately concerned for their physical safety. And these are just nonpartisan election officials carrying out the nuts and bolts of elections. These are not partisan people. So when you take that arena, that atmosphere, that charged political nature that's been infesting the operation of our elections, and put this request from the Department of Justice on top of it, you could see how it could just have a chill on participation by these election workers, both in Georgia and across the country.
Yeah, I mean, Michael Feinberg, the chill is about what happens next, right? But this is what has already happened. This is more from Ruby Freeman on the threat she faced to her physical safety. And this is questioning from the January 6th Select Committee public hearings from Adam Schiff to lifelong Republican Rusty Bowers and how he was harassed, predicated on the same lies. Let me show you both of those.
The protesters who occupied the Arizona House of Representatives building included Proud Boys, while men armed with rifles stood just outside the entrance. I understand these protesters were calling for you by name, Speaker Bowers. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Rusty Bowers went on, Michael Feinberg, to describe how trucks with billboards were driving back and forth outside of his house while a family member, I believe it was his daughter, was gravely ill, calling him a pedophile. Ruby Freeman also went on to describe those threats. Let me play more of her as well.
There is nowhere I feel safe. Nowhere. Do you know how it feels to have the President of the United States to target you? The President of the United States is supposed to represent every American, not to target one. But he targeted me, Lady Ruby, a small business owner, a mother, a proud American citizen who stand up to help Fulton County run an election in the middle of the pandemic.
Other people who face threats to their life and safety and their families: Chris Krebs, lifelong Republican; Miles Taylor, lifelong Republican; Adam Kinzinger, who was my guest here yesterday; Liz Cheney, who also defected, if you will, from the Trump cult and led the January 6th Select Committee hearings; Mark Milley, Mark Esper, Brad Raffensperger. I guess what all those names have in common is they're all Republicans. And I wonder if you have any theories, Michael Feinberg, on how long Republicans will do the wrong thing, thinking that it will make them safe.
Well, I would argue with the premise that Republicans still exist. There's a party by that name. It appears on ballots, but it has become completely unmoored from any conservative philosophical or political principles, which guided it for most of the 20th and what we've seen so far of the 21st century. And of course, that takeover begins with Donald Trump in 2016. I'm quite sure that none of the Republican luminaries today are familiar with the works of Russell Kirk or George Nash or William F. Buckley, or could even identify any of those three individuals out of a lineup. They've become a cult of personality, and the personality they have chosen to worship is somebody who has no problem calling half the country radical leftist scum on a regular basis, and has no problem dispatching his proxies to make his critics' lives miserable. And I don't want to diminish the experiences of anybody you just named, but I think what we're potentially looking at is orders of magnitude worse going forward. Because in the aftermath of the 2020 election, It was private citizens working for Trump in a campaign capacity who were doing the harassment. One could recover civil damages from them. They could be prosecuted. But now that it's being done under the aegis of the Justice Department, there's a whole host of immunity considerations that come into account that may prevent future people like Mr. Bowers or the two Freemans from ever seeing any sort of justice if their life is similarly destroyed.